Good evening and welcome to the Omaha Metro Virtual Property Tax Town Hall. I'm Jim Vogel. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Platt Institute. I'll be your host tonight, and I'm joined by Nicole Fox and Adam Weinberg from my staff. Our team at the Platt Institute focuses on removing barriers to growth and opportunity in Nebraska. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with Nebraskans from all different points of view to advance policies that help people keep more of what they earn, make it easier to start and grow a business, and to build a talented workforce in our state. The local property tax burden in Nebraska imposes a barrier in each of those areas, and while in years past, the unicameral has struggled to build a consensus on a change in property tax policy, the legislature appears ready to give its approval to a new plan that could potentially increase the state's role in addressing local property taxes. In today's virtual town hall, we want to hear your thoughts. We'll discuss the new property tax legislation, LB 1107, as well as other proposals for property tax changes. Let us know if you think the legislature's current proposal meets your needs, or if there are other approaches you'd prefer. Of course, some property tax changes may not come from the legislature at all, but from voters. In recent years, grassroots groups have sought to pass property tax changes through a voter initiative. But in the past 2 years, no measure has qualified for the ballot, so we'll also discuss the ballot initiative process. Now, tonight's town hall is meant to be an interactive event. You can join our team to discuss how property taxes impact you and to share your thoughts on ways to make things better. If you'd like a moment to speak on camera or over audio to share your thoughts, please just include that request with your Q&A submission, and a member of our team will get in touch with you by chat. You can also join the discussion through the chat window or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen here on Zoom. Then I'll call on you when it's time to join the discussion. We'll also be running live polls on property tax issues throughout tonight's town hall. Let me show you how it will work by kicking off tonight's first poll question. When we start a new poll, a question will appear on your screen. Just select your answer and click submit to have your vote counted in the poll. Let's launch our poll number one. For tonight's first question, let's get a sense of how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted your priorities. With everything that has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in Nebraska, are you more concerned about property taxes, less concerned about property taxes, or about as concerned as before? Now you can make your selection on the screen, more concerned, less concerned, or about as concerned as before. And while we wait for everyone to cast their vote, Nicole, you keep a close eye on legislative action in Lincoln. Can you tell us a bit about how the legislature settled on LB 1107 as a compromise? This proposal only came to light about a week ago, so many may be hearing about it for the first time.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, the last couple of legislative sessions have been very interesting. So we kicked off the 106th legislature in 2019 with the introduction of LB 289. And a big component of LB 289 in terms of property tax reform was to expand the sales tax base to help provide some property tax relief. Unfortunately, that was met with significant opposition, not just by special interests, but it was also met by opposition through the executive branch. So that option came off the table. Eventually, things morphed into LB 974 and LB 1106. This had an education funding component because in Nebraska, we currently, property taxes fund about 60% of our state's education needs. And so it was a proposal to increase state funding. That too was met with significant opposition, and that led to LB 1107. And LB 1107 has a couple of components. The first component is that it takes our current property tax credit fund and establishes a floor. And so that floor will be $275 million. And that was a part of a proposal put forth by Senator Tom Breezy to create that floor. Now, on top of that, there is a gambling ballot initiative out there. And so if that proposal should pass, revenues from that would be added to this property tax credit fund. Then there's a second component. And so what LB 1107 does is it adds another fund. And what this fund is it's an income tax credit. And in year one of this proposal, that tax credit, the total amount will be $125 million. And over time, over 5 years, that will grow to $375 million. And that growth is related to some revenue triggers. If cash revenue, or if revenues are greater than 3.5%, and if our cash reserve is at least $500 million, then 100% of that revenue will go into the property tax credit fund. So that's kind of an overview. That's kind of where we're at right now. Definitely things have evolved.
Thanks, Nicole. The voting is now closed on tonight's first live poll, and here are the results. 21% of you are more concerned, and 79% of you are about as concerned as before. Nobody tonight who has voted is less concerned since the pandemic. Appreciate everyone voting. So now that people know how our polling works, let's get to the most current news on the property tax front. Last week, the Nebraska legislature gave first round approval to LB 1107, the new property tax compromise plan. Adam and Nicole, can you guys walk us through the overall impact 1107 would have on property taxes in Nebraska? Why don't we start with you, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. And folks, what I'm going to do here first, and by the way, if you'd like to participate in tonight's program, just send us a Q&A question or a comment, and we'll make sure to have you here on our program, whether you'd like to do it by just asking us a question, if you'd like to appear in the program, if you'd like to be a part of the chat through audio. You're all welcome. We'd really like your thoughts as part of tonight's program. Helps us learn what we should be doing in our work here at the Platt Institute. What I'm going to do is set up a screen share right now so that you can see a file of just basically how the tax relief programs that we have in Nebraska are laid out. And I'll be just one moment setting that up for you. But one of the things that we need to discuss as we're talking about the different types of tax policies that we're approaching in Nebraska is what's the difference between tax relief and tax reform. And what we have right now in Nebraska is tax relief, where the state is going and spending a significant amount of money to defray the cost of your property taxes. And they're doing that by using revenue from your sales and income tax dollars. And so I want to show you here, if I can, the current property tax relief programs that we have available in Nebraska. So when I say property tax relief, I'm talking really universally here. What is state money, so your sales and income and other types of taxes that the state collects, that are being used to defray the cost and offset the cost of property taxes. And if you look here, really the biggest chunk is what people know of as our education funding formula. This is K through 12 education spending at the state level that local school districts receive through our formula. And so this is a big chunk here. It's over $1 billion, okay? Presumably, if we did not have this source of revenue, we'd have higher property taxes as a result, because property taxes for school districts, other than car taxes and some other things like fees and fines from the police, that's pretty much all school districts have to tap into right now in Nebraska. So that's a big part of it. But what we also have that you might be accustomed to hearing about when we talk about property tax relief is the Property Tax Credit Relief Fund. Maybe a few years back, you got a postcard like this one. It's a yellow one. Sorry if my screen is taken away. And it tells you how much you got in a credit where the state paid a portion of your property tax to local governments. And if you look here on the screen, right now the state is spending $275 million a year in the current Property Tax Credit Relief Fund. This is a fund where the state is not reducing your property taxes, but they're paying it for you through money that you paid in other taxes, sales and income taxes. And that is a credit against the property taxes that you would otherwise owe, that your local government is levying against your property. We also have some other programs like the homestead exemption here, which is currently at $85 million. And the homestead exemption is also paid with state revenues, and its purpose is to make sure that people who absolutely cannot or are not believed to have the ability to pay, particularly disabled veterans, seniors, have some of the cost of their property tax defrayed so that they're not forced out of their homes. That's another state source of revenue that's being used to pay for property taxes. So all of this stuff that I just showed you right here is where we are right now as far as the property tax relief programs that Nebraska has. Now we have LB 1107, which has been passed through the first round of legislative debate in Nebraska. And LB 1107 would create another property tax relief program. So it does not change the structure of property taxes. You will pay your property taxes like you always do in Nebraska. The levies will be the same as they are. Your valuations will continue to increase if your valuations increase, and for a lot of us, they're increasing. What LB 1107 attempts to do is create a different form of property tax relief by crediting you back a direct rebate through your income taxes. So the proposal is, and let me see if I can, forgive me, this was probably a better example here. I should have started on this slide, but just to reframe here, here's the education aid, here's the current property tax credit, here's the homestead exemption, and here's the income tax credit. Okay, so the income tax credit, over time, the goal is to get it to $375 million by 2024. That's the goal. Right now, if it were to pass in the legislature this year, it would start at $125 million. So a portion of what we currently pay for the property tax credit fund. So you would see an income tax credit. What does that mean? It's a refundable income tax credit, which means if you owe school property taxes, now this policy only applies to your school property tax, doesn't apply to your city property taxes, your county property taxes, so forth. Just the school property taxes. So this $125 million in the first year is taken, and a percentage of that, legislative authors think it'll be about 6% of your school taxes will be credited back on your income taxes, on your state level. Now, if you owe income taxes, your state income taxes will be reduced by that amount of the credit. If you don't owe income taxes and you file your income taxes, then you will receive a refund from the state for that amount of school property taxes that are credited through this credit. And the goal with 1107 is to structure it, as Nicole was saying, so that in the years ahead, in 21 and 22 and 23, when the state reserves and state revenues are sufficient, the legislature will put more money into this income tax credit, which would theoretically increase the amount of the tax credit that you're receiving. Now, you got to keep in mind, your local property taxes might go up during that same period of time. So that could eat into how much of the credit that you would receive back. But the goal is ultimately to get where we are here in 2024, where the income tax credit would be at $375 million, and that would be used to credit people on their income taxes. Now, what do you have to give up in exchange? You'll notice there's a little bit of a difference between this chart and that chart. Now, one of the changes that they are making does impact property taxes, because one of the other current property tax relief programs that the state has is called the personal property tax exemption. Now, this only impacts businesses, but it's a significant tax on businesses as far as their tax compliance. Personal property tax in this context is the tax that businesses pay on their business equipment. So even here, we at the Platt Institute have paid personal property tax on desks and computers and chairs and things like that. You have to put all that, account for it, and pay property tax on it. What the state does right now is they give the first $10,000 in assessed value, they pay for it through state income and sales taxes so that businesses have that cost offset. One of the ways that the state is seeking to pay for LB 1107 is to remove this personal property tax exemption. So now granted, it's pretty small. It's about $14 or $15 million. So it's not gonna pay for the whole thing, but that was one of the pay-fors, as they call them, that they agreed to. So that's the overall idea of 1107, is to kind of increase the number of property tax relief programs that the state is taking on with the goal of getting to 375 million by 2024, and the potential that this property tax credit program could grow if there's a future ballot initiative where voters approve other types of revenue sources. So that was maybe more than you bargained for in signing up for this call, but that is basically how 1107 works. And I defer to Nicole if she has any thoughts on things I might have missed.
No, Adam, I think you covered that wonderfully. The most important thing, as Adam mentioned, is that when it comes to the income tax credit portion, it is only in regards to the school property taxes that are paid. So one of the things with LB 1107 that we need to keep in mind is that it is just one step. If this gets across the finish line this week, debates on property taxes and reform is not over. The work will need to continue because we need to introduce structural reforms and get those across the finish line as well.
Yeah, your property taxes will continue to go up. So that's one of the downsides that couldn't make it through this compromise. And Jim, the reason it's a compromise is because we had a legislature where we could not get agreement on whether local political subdivisions would give up any of their taxing authority in exchange for this state money. Because theoretically, you could take this 375 million or 125 million or whatever you want to call it and give it to local political subdivisions, which is what we do right now with the property tax credit. And you could say, okay, we're going to give you this amount of money, but in exchange, you have to reduce your ability to levy property taxes by this amount. And there was no agreement between local political subdivisions and either the governor's office or the legislature on how to go about doing that. Particularly, the fight was over whether school spending should be capped in any particular way, and they couldn't come to an agreement. So the compromise was that this new program was going to be created, And maybe we'll figure it out over the period of time whether there's some limits, because, and I hope they do, because one of the other features of 1107 is that in future years, this tax credit would continue to grow if property tax assessments grow by the amount that it does. They're still working on some of the language, but it'd be based on the percentage in assessed value growth for the whole state. So if this 375 million were to come to be, then in a year in the future where assessments overall grew at 4%, that fund should grow at 4%. But that means more and more of the state budget is going to have to go directly to taxpayers and rebates, and less of the state budget can go and pay for government services that are meant to be funded with sales tax and income tax dollars. So that could be a real predicament for the state if property taxes continue to grow and consequently the credit continues to grow. So that is definitely something that when we say property tax reform, it refers to how do we put more appropriate restraints on property taxes at the local level so that the state isn't just chasing its tail trying to spend money that isn't going to actually make a difference in your experience as a taxpayer.
Appreciate that, Adam and Nicole. Thanks to both of you for those thoughts. So now that you've heard a little bit more about 1107, let's do another poll and get your reaction.
And I'll be just a moment here pulling it up, Jim. And
Thanks,
here we go.
Adam. All right. The legislature's current property tax proposal, LB 1107, promises to provide property owners $375 million in additional credits annually for school property taxes paid by 2024. Last year, a property valued at $100,000 received $104 in a credit under the current property tax relief program. This new proposal is likely to more than double that amount through local property, although local property taxes could still continue to rise. What's your level of satisfaction with this proposal? Are you very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, either satisfied or dissatisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied? And while we're waiting for those votes to come in, are there other legislative efforts on property taxes that people should know about, Nicole and Adam?
Nicole, you want to take that first? I think they've heard enough from me already.
All right. Well, there have been a couple of both proposals introduced, and there has been a proposal that has gotten across the finish line. So I'll start with what got across the finish line. And that was LB 103, sponsored by Senator Linehan, chair of the Revenue Committee. That passed the legislature overwhelmingly in 2019. So essentially what LB 103 does is what it recognizes what I would call a new way to define what a property tax increase is. So in the past, when we thought about property tax increases and our taxes going up, we tended to think of it in terms of, did the levy go up? And what LB 103 does is it takes a look at, are you paying more money this year, say, as opposed to last year? So because of the fact that our valuations are increasing over the years, but our levies are remaining the same, the old analogy might be that, well, a politician or a taxing entity might say, well, we didn't increase your taxes because we didn't increase your levy. But with rising valuations, what Senator Linehan's bill does is it says, but if you don't adjust the levy so that the amount you pay in year one is the same as what you're going to be billed for this next year, year two, then that is a tax increase. And so what LB 103 does is it requires that a special hearing, or not hearing, but a special meeting is held to disclose that there has been an increase in revenue brought in, and that particular taxing entity is hoping to collect that windfall and spend it, and they have to take a vote. So I think that's a really good reform. It's very transparent. It makes us understand the taxes that we're paying a little bit better. Some other proposals that have been out there, ones that have not gotten across the finish line. One is LRCA 3 or 8, I believe. What this was it proposed a 3% valuation increase. And while we know that spending is a big part of the property tax puzzle, and we need to control spending, what we have to realize are, sometimes we put forth issues and there may be unintended consequences. So with this 3% proposal, what we have to remember is that we do legitimately have parts of our state that are growing extremely rapidly. And when I think of, in particular, I think of Western Douglas County and Western Sarpy County. And so some of those subdivisions are growing faster than the 3%. And as Adam mentioned, when it comes to government spending, we have to think about things that are very critical, things that are absolute necessities that we don't want to cut spending on, like public safety and roads and infrastructure. So that is one that was put out there, but it did not cross the finish line. And then finally, there is a proposal that was put forth by Senator Ben Hansen that is known as truth in taxation. So what this essentially is a little bit more teeth to LB 103, because what we found after LB 103 was passed and went into effect, there were political subdivisions that were trying to get around it. And the other thing too is just kind of the reality of our busy lives. Not all citizens are able to pay, to monitor, and because you have to monitor closely what is going on in all of these multiple taxing political subdivisions. And so what Truth in Taxation does is it says, if you are a political subdivision that is looking to potentially capture a windfall and not adjust your levy down to keep the property tax paid the same from year to year, you not only have to have a public hearing, but you also have to provide the public with notice mailed to their homes. Because think about it, I mean, with kids, school activities and just our busy work lives, we may not be able, if we're not paying attention, we don't know. And so this, if you get a mailing that says, hey, your property taxes are going to be going up and there's going to be this public meeting that you can participate in to listen in or to vocalize, to be vocal about your thoughts, that's going to cause some pause by the members of that entity. And it kind of puts them, it holds them accountable, because they may, if there's a lot of participation by the public, they may be a little bit less likely to vote for the windfall. So those are a couple of things. Adam, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about it later in the program. I will just add quickly that I think one of the benefits to that idea of truth in taxation is you can always say, of course, the accountability and the transparency. I think another one that may be understated and underappreciated is the fact that giving taxpayers this information in their mailboxes so that they can see it, they can know that they are able to go to a public event, or ideally, as we're talking about in the pandemic and hopefully in the future, electronically like we are tonight, to engage these things. I think it helps create more buy-in and more awareness so people aren't blindsided, because I think that Nebraskans generally are pretty understanding when local officials come to them and they have an idea about how property taxes can be used to make a positive difference in the community. And we're not, fundamentally against people having that local control to decide that they think that they should levy a tax in their community to do something that's important to them. So I think having that buy-in where you're informing taxpayers means that there'll be more consistency between the desires of local officials and taxpayers about where they're headed. And I think that can create more understanding about the community's future.
All right, let's take a look at those poll results from our second question. We asked about 1107 and how you feel about that as a package. 6% say you're very satisfied, 17% say somewhat satisfied, 11% neither satisfied or dissatisfied, 50% of you are still somewhat dissatisfied, and 17% very dissatisfied. That's very interesting. That's the first time we obviously have asked that poll question since 1107 came about. Before we, I think, Adam, do we got someone we're going to bring on?
Yeah, I'm going to bring on a guest here, and let's see if the internet is still with us. I'm going to make sure that, well, the internet is not with us right now, as is the case for many people in Omaha, as we've had trees and all kinds of terrible things, and I hope everyone's well and safe. So we'll move on. Oh, you know what? Actually, I see him now. I'm going to invite on Rich from Plattsmouth. Sorry, Rich, I didn't mean to count you out there. He was in the section for the chat saying, "Hey, I'm here." So I'm going to see if we can bring Rich on now. Rich, you should be on. Can you hear us? And is your mic on?
I can hear you. Can you hear me all right?
Fantastic. I can hear you just fine. Well, welcome to the town hall. And Rich, you had some thoughts about property taxes that you wanted to share with folks. And I think we'd like to pick your brain a little bit about the conversation we're having as well.
the poll result doesn't surprise me. I'm pretty dissatisfied with LB 1107, I believe. But in all of these things, what we're doing is we're talking about tax schemes to get out of paying taxes. And the reality is we have a spending problem. And I recognize that the teacher union lobby is the most powerful lobby in the state. In the unicameral, they are all over everything that could threaten their power and their authority. But the reality is we're spending $12,500 per student in Nebraska to educate kids. And I could cut that budget by 75%. It's not even in the realm of plausibility for someone to spend that much money to educate a student every year. We have schools being built all over the place. We have a pandemic going on, and they're fixing the blacksmith schools, and people pass bond issues, and it's a ridiculous amount of spending. Now, I understand that, everybody says that they love their kids and then they burden them with this debt. But so what's wrong with the LR 300 CA, which is where we shift this from property taxes to a sales tax?
Well, I think your question is a good one that we're going to bring up later in the program. We're going to talk about LR 300 CA is the legislative title for the consumption tax. But can I press you just a little bit, since you were kind enough to be with us? I mean, you said 75%. I mean, when you're talking about salaries and healthcare benefits and pensions and things like that, do you really think you could cut what the school districts in this state are spending by 75%?
Yeah, anybody on the program, I can send your kid to private school for $2,000 a year.
Yeah, but there are other costs that in a private school system. Now, you bring up a very interesting point. One I have plenty of history talking about here at the Platt Institute, but I mean, 75% is a really big number.
Yeah, that's about that's what it cost when I graduated from high school. And I realized that there is, inflation, but I would be willing to buy any public school after it's been deemed obsolete and turn that into a private enterprise, and it would be just fine. We are spending money in the education just for the sake of spending money in the education. How a bond issue is bad is if it supports public school spending. And not only that, when I ran for school board in Plattsmouth, which I honestly don't want to be on school board, people requested that I run, I homeschool my kids. I don't even have children in the public schools, because they are not aligned with my values, if that makes sense. I'm not interested in burdening my kids with massive amounts of economic debt, with no Milton Friedman type economics being taught. It just is not. We're going so far off the rails in our public school systems. And again, I realize we have a teachers union which holds everybody at gunpoint to make sure that they get their due, but very little of that money is getting to the teachers. and I see questions on here about legalizing marijuana and gambling. Well, I mean, what keeps a conservative in a state, right? If you legalize marijuana and gambling and we have high taxes, I just don't see any point to Nebraska. At some point we can go to, Kristen Noem up there in South Dakota, and we can live there. It just doesn't make any sense. We live here because it's conservative. It's a good life. We have normal people that are just regular folks. And we don't have the crazy East Coast and left in the West Coast. And we want to maintain that good life attitude in Nebraska.
Thank you, Rich, for participating in the program today and for your thoughts. You mentioned the school lobby, and that was one of the reasons that we got to LB 1107. They certainly are a force to be reckoned with, and they stopped the progress of 1106, which would have controlled the spending component associated with school spending and property taxes. And so you do bring up a good point. And at the end of the day, 1107 includes not only property tax relief, it's about the incentive package, it's about UNMC's next project. And so it took a lot of consensus and people coming together to get to this point. But it isn't without certainly the opposition of forces that got us to that point. So thank you. If Nebraskans are not happy with the results of this compromise from LB 1107, another way property tax issues can be approached is through a voter initiative, which we'd also like to get your feedback about tonight. There are two ways initiatives can get on the ballot in Nebraska. The first is that a state senator can introduce a resolution for a ballot measure. But in order for an issue to get in front of voters that way, the legislature would have to approve giving Nebraskans the chance to vote on either a law or a constitutional amendment. But the legislature has already weighed in on what it hopes to do on property taxes. So the second way an issue gets on the ballot is through a petition drive that is authorized by the Nebraska Secretary of State. Adam, do you want to talk a bit about how this petition drives generally work? And I think this is also a good segue into another question that we have in the Q&A section from Maureen.
Yeah, well, ballot initiatives are kind of a unique, in fact, we're one of the states that really started the direct democracy kind of movement of ballot initiatives. They have a long history here in Nebraska. The people kind of function as a second house, especially in our unicameral legislature state. And so there are two kinds of ways, like you said, that you can do a ballot initiative. One is at least at the grassroots level, as a petition drive. You have to get a petition drive authorized by the Secretary of State here in Nebraska by a campaign committee, and they have to authorize circulators, who are their people who go out and collect signatures, and they really have to follow the letter of the law in the way they collect those signatures. And there are two kinds of campaigns for a ballot initiative anyway that mainly are carried out. There are the other initiatives related to canceling legislation, but we won't deal with that tonight. Let's just talk about passing a new law. A new law can be passed as a statute, so it's like a law passed by the public. And with that, you need, I think it's 7% of the voters adopted onto a petition. And if you want to pass it as a constitutional amendment, which means only another constitutional amendment can change it, then you need 10% of the voters. So it's a significant number of registered voters who have to sign on your petition. All of those signatures have to be validated by the county in which they were authorized to collect those signatures. They have to be registered voters who have legibly and completely filled it out, that it was individually signed. And here's another threshold that ballot initiatives have to go through, whether they're a statute or a constitutional amendment. They have to have, I believe it's 36 registered voters, 5% of the registered voters in 36 counties, maybe it's 38 counties, maybe somebody correct me on the chat section. It's about a third of the counties that you need to have at least 5% of the registered voters signed onto your petition as well for it to qualify for the ballot. And the reason, of course, is because if it was just a sheer number of voters, the reasoning is anyway, legally speaking, if we just wanted a number of voters, we could go here in Omaha, we could go to Lincoln, we go to maybe Grand Island and Kearney, and we might be able to get enough voters theoretically. What that requirement and threshold means is that a ballot petition has to have a certain threshold of support with communities across the state who want to see it on the ballot. And then, of course, that's just the beginning. I probably glossed over some of the complexities of ballot campaigns, but that's just qualifying for the ballot, which we've seen grassroots campaigns have had a hard time doing. So really, it needs to be, to this day and age, needs to be a paid, organized effort where you have paid signature gatherers who are going out and doing an organized campaign. And once they get on the ballot, then they have to go and campaign for that issue and get it, voters to approve it against what, sure, and especially with a campaign issue like property taxes, there's going to be some opposition, and it could be well-financed opposition. So the undertaking of a ballot initiative is no small task, even in a relatively low population state like Nebraska.
Do you want to address maybe Maureen's question, Adam, about the support that the gambling or marijuana issue had in the legislature? I think that is directly relevant to these
Maureen
ballots.
asked, how likely is it that the legislature will support alternative revenue sources like legalizing gambling or marijuana to keep property taxes at bay? It seems not very likely, but I think there was kind of an indirect, especially as it relates to 1107, kind of an indirect plan B. If the voters do approve the casino gambling initiatives, we want to use that funding, as the initiative calls for, as I understand, for the property tax credit relief fund. And the reason they put that in LB 1107 is because they wanted to make sure that that revenue was not used as an alternative for the money they've already put into the fund, because there's 275 in there, 275 million right now. So what they are saying in LB 1107 is, if the gambling petition, if it passes on the ballot this fall, then the revenues that would be raised from that would go into the property tax credit relief fund in addition to what's in the property tax credit relief fund right now. So as far as that, whether it may not be up to the legislature, but the legislature has kind of in a backward, in a behind the scenes kind of way said, we still want that revenue if it passes. As far as the legalization of marijuana, we have a ballot initiative that's likely to be on there on medical. We're going to talk a little bit about the sales tax base. And so medical products often are not really taxed in many states the same way. So the revenue raising potential under our current tax code may not be as great if the medical marijuana ballot initiative were to pass. But if in the future voters decided they want to take that step further, maybe there'd be other things to talk about, whether that would be through the legislature. You know, we have a legislature in which you really need 33 votes, or really don't need 17 opposing votes to make sure that your ballot, that your legislation isn't gridlocked. So if there's 17 people who don't want to see the legalization of marijuana recreationally, for example, in the Nebraska legislature, then I suspect that'll be something that the voters would have to decide in the near future.
Thanks, Adam. We've talked about some of the ideas that people have brought forward for ballot initiatives. And by the way, if you have an idea for a property tax ballot initiative, you can share it in the Q&A section. You're even welcome to chime in on camera or audio if you'd like to join the discussion. One of the issues we've discussed at the Platt Institute extensively is eliminating sales tax exemptions in order to achieve property tax reform. Before we get into how that relates to ballot initiatives, do the two of you want to discuss what sales tax exemptions are and how they relate to property taxes?
Sure. I mean, sales tax exemptions basically are what we should be paying on sales taxes, but we're not, because most of the things we buy in Nebraska, believe it or not, even though we would intuitively think you buy something, you pay sales tax, but not true in most cases right now in Nebraska. And that's not, in many states that's the case, but in a number of states that are notable for having lower taxes like South Dakota, actually people pay sales taxes on a much wider variety of goods and services. And so sales tax exemptions and revisiting those is asking what exemptions do we have where people are buying goods or services, not currently paying taxes on them? And could closing those exemptions enable us to make improvements to our tax code so that we would not be paying as high of tax rates for the things that we purchase, or for the property that we own, or for the income that we earn? And we have definitely come down on the side, and I think most people, left or right in the economics field, specifically have come down on the side that getting rid of sales tax exemptions is one of the most economically neutral, stable, fair ways to raise revenue for government that could be used to make your tax system less harmful to economic opportunity, because you're not raising a tax rate. In fact, you can cut them by lowering sales tax exemptions, but you do have to go overcome the objection that there are things people are not paying sales tax on right now that they kind of enjoy not paying sales tax on right now. So that's the problem that we're in.
Nicole, any further thoughts on sales tax exemptions?
No, I 100% agree with Adam. When Nebraska instituted their sales tax in 1967, Nebraska was our economy in terms of the sales tax base. It was primarily a goods-based economy. And over time, we've evolved into more of a service-based economy, but we have not taxed those services. So yeah, so for example, I mean, if I go and I buy a car, I'm gonna pay sales tax on that car. But if I have an older car and that car needs repair, I am not paying sales tax on that car repair. So there's a lot of opportunity there to generate more revenue for our state. And I think if we're going to grow our state, we have to be more competitive. And as Adam said, I mean, if we can expand our sales tax base, not only does it generate more revenue, but we could potentially lower our sales tax rate.
Yeah, if you do it enough. And there are a lot of things in our sales tax system that just don't make sense. Now, we have and sometimes it's a good thing, we have a very populist approach to taxes in the United States. So the idea of imposing a sales tax on something just seems wrong to people, because when you buy something, you always feel that you need it when you buy it. So why should you pay a tax on it? But what I would point out to people is in Nebraska, we already impose a very hefty property tax. And so the money that you're paying in sales tax is really already being assessed on you in property tax in a way that could unpredictably increase on you, especially with the way valuations are going, not just in ag now, but in urban areas as well. And so, you know, people say, well, I don't like the idea of paying sales tax for me to go get a haircut. But I got to tell you, you're probably paying a lot of haircuts worth of sales tax on your property tax right now. So you got to think that through of which would you rather do? Would you rather be in the position where you get to decide when and where you go and spend your money? Or do you want it more of your tax to come out in property tax? And I'm not going to beat up totally on property tax in a very reactionary way, so to speak, because property tax is a stable tax. It provides good sources of revenue for local government, and you can count on, even in the pandemic right now, our local governments know how much they're collecting in property tax. So that's a positive. But at the same time, we know very well how much we're paying in property tax. So we have to decide which of these taxes and what balance of them do we prefer. And so if you look at The example I've used on other programs is we've got an office here, and we sometimes bring breakfast in the morning. If I want to bring everybody Egg McMuffins, which I still haven't done, Jim, so maybe one of these days I'll have to do it. But if I bring everybody Egg McMuffins, I pay sales tax on the Egg McMuffins because I bought them at a restaurant. But if I go to the donut shop and I buy them a dozen donuts, those are considered a bakery item. Like they're prepared, they're grocery items basically under the tax code, so you don't pay any sales tax on them. If I buy a lawnmower and want to mow my lawn, I pay sales tax on the lawnmower. But if I hire somebody to mow my lawn, I don't pay sales tax for that service. So through all of these exemptions that we've created, the vast majority of what people are buying right now, and some of it is stuff that's politically difficult to talk about, like groceries and gasoline and medical devices and things like that. But at the end of the day, we can have those exemptions, but then ultimately what it means is we want government to spend money, we have to pay other taxes to make up that difference in revenue. So we have to pay higher property taxes, we have to pay higher income taxes, or even we have to pay a higher sales tax rate than what we're paying right now. So these are all questions that we have to resolve as we talk about how sales tax policy could change. And with 1107, I'm sorry to interrupt, Jim, but with 1107, they've made this commitment that they want to spend money again, because that's what they're doing with 1107. So if they need $375 million for that, I mean, one way they could do it is reducing sales tax exemptions to fund it. It's important, though, that they get a handle on how property taxes are growing, or they're going to be keeping to do that for a long time.
As Jeff properly points out in the question and comment section, is that we are only advocating for the expansion of the sales tax base if taxes go down with those funds. So I appreciate, Jeff, you mentioning that. So there are senators in the legislature who want to supercharge this idea of expanding the sales tax base by moving to what they call the consumption tax. Basically, the consumption tax is just a sales tax that applies to pretty much everything that you buy except for used goods. And the proponents favor this because they want to use it as a way to replace the local property tax, the state income tax, and a number of other state and local taxes. What are the pros and cons here, Nicole and Adam?
Well, I would say most definitely to start out with the pros. Initially, it sounds very simple, and a simple tax code is good. The less complex it is, the better. What the consumption tax would do would be it would eliminate, pretty much all taxes in our state other than a sales tax, the gas tax, and then of course there is some language, or in what was proposed there was some language to limit taxation on business inputs. So you get rid of property tax, you get rid of income tax, you get rid of inheritance tax, and a variety of taxes, and it all seems really simple. But there are some trade-offs. Number one, to be able to eliminate all those extra taxes, or other taxes, I should say, not extra. You're talking about a tax rate that's in the double digits, and we don't know how much that is. The initial estimation that was put forth in this year's proposal was, about 10.5, 10.65%, I think, if I remember correctly. But that's not a guarantee. We may require a higher rate than that. So, I mean, that is something that might give somebody pause. And if you think about our state, where a majority of the population lives close to borders, particularly Iowa, that may lead to some border bleed. It's one thing if maybe I need to go to the store and buy, say, a tube of toothpaste or a roll of paper towels. That's one thing. But if I'm making a major purchase, such as a new car, or I'm stocking up on a lot of supplies, or buying something else that's extremely expensive, there's a chance that I'm going to go to another state to make that major purchase. Now, kind of switching gears here, the pro for what was proposed, or not the pro, but a component of what was proposed, is that this tax would only apply to initial consumption. So, for example, if I wanted to buy a new car, I would pay a hefty tax on it. But if I wanted to avoid paying a tax, and I didn't want to have to travel to another state to buy a new car to avert paying such a high tax, I could have the option of buying something used. So for some people, it gives them a little bit of control as to whether or not they want to be frugal and try and save money. But then there's also that notion of, when you are taxing everything, you have to keep in mind that sometimes life throws us hurdles, and we have unplanned expenditures such as, a car repair or, a home repair or something. And so it's bad enough sometimes when we find out that we maybe have to replace a major appliance or, something like that. But then to also have repair on it and tax on it, that adds to the cost.
Yeah, and that is back to the point that to replace all of those taxes, you would need to have a really hefty tax rate in order to do it. And so the appeal of saying, well, we don't need assessors anymore, and we don't need as much revenue collection to keep track of income taxes. I mean, there's a lot of appeal there, but then there's also some real governance issues, is that if I have to pay a 10.5, for example, that's the example we'll use tonight, a 10.5% sales tax for everything I buy except for used goods, it's definitely going to impact my, it's going to feel the same in many respects as paying property taxes, just not all at once, because you are talking about, one of the great things about a sales tax is that at a relatively low rate, you can collect a lot of revenue without people noticing much. And there was a famous tax economist who once said, the ideal of a tax system is so that the tax system acts like a pickpocket and not like a mugger. And so when you get to 10.5, 11% on groceries, on gas, on potentially a hospital bill, you're going to feel like you got mugged. So there is an aspect to that even though the trade-off sounds amazing, you're going to have to ask. People are going to have to ask themselves what they really want. And so those are some of the governance issues that have prevented. By the way, Rich was asking, has the constitutional amendment in the legislature gone? There's a constitutional amendment that was filed as a bill in the legislature for this. Has it gone anywhere? No, it won't be going anywhere this year. It had not gotten out of the Revenue Committee, and the legislature will conclude by the end of this week. So it will really be, and I've heard from the supporters that it will be a ballot initiative idea that they want to float. And so we're getting your feedback tonight about where it goes. But that's one of the governance issues. The other one that I think comes up is it really going to be 10.5%? Because what about local political subdivisions that don't really have much else but property? Will they need to have their own consumption tax? And if so, will their consumption tax be a much higher rate one if they don't have a lot of retail in their community, or they have expenses that were previously being paid by the property tax? So I'm all about moving to a more consumption-based tax system. If you look around the world, lots of countries have very broad-based consumption taxes that they use so that they don't have to have as high of corporate taxes or as high of property taxes. So I'm with you there, but I think the idea that it has to be, we don't have any income tax, we don't have any property tax, and we just rely on a consumption tax, it creates some issues. And so we'd be very interested in your thoughts, because at the end of the day, you can throw the economics textbook out the window if nobody cares. And so we'd like to know what you think.
Adam, do you want to address the consumption tax versus a sales tax?
Yeah, I mean, the consumption tax is a sales tax. The difference is, as supporters would have it, is that because the consumption tax in its sales tax base excludes used goods, that is a difference, and I guess it gives you some measure of control. I do think there's some unfairness in there, though, because the person who goes and buys a bicycle to get to work is paying more sales tax than the person who buys a used Mercedes. So there are problems with exempting used goods, but that's basically the difference. And then the consumption taxes may be called as such because it's different than the system we have. It's meant to move our system more towards comprehensively taxing all the consumption in our economy, so consumer consumption. So, I mean, it's a branding difference, but fundamentally, it's a really broad-based sales tax that taxes you on almost everything you buy.
Yeah, and there were a couple of comments in regards to the consumption tax and it being a regressive tax. And I do know in the proposal that was put forth this particular session that they were, because of the regressivity, they were proposing a credit to offset some of that regressivity.
Thank you for mentioning that, Nicole. Yeah, that is a whole other thing. We can have a whole other,
discussion,
a whole other webinar on plattinstitute.org.
All right. Thanks to both of you for your thoughts, and everybody that's weighing in the chat room as well, or the chat section. So let's do another poll, Adam, now that we've talked over this idea. How would you vote on a constitutional amendment to end local property and state income taxes, replacing them with a 10.5% sales tax on all new consumer goods and services you purchase? Let us know if you support, oppose, or are undecided. All right. Adam, a lot of people don't like property taxes, of course. I don't either. Has any other state tried or succeeded in getting rid of property taxes altogether?
Well, that's a good question, Jim. I mean, the basic answer is no. There are no tax, and this is the other thing about a consumption tax replacing all other taxes is we would have to be the first. And granted, I'm not against that. You know, this was the country that was the first to land a man on the moon and return safely to the earth. And so if we can do it on property taxes, that would be great. But the only other state that in recent history, there are some state movements that have tried to remove local property taxes. And there are some states that have very low property taxes, like Hawaii particularly. They rely heavily on a broad-based consumption tax. So it's not impossible, but they still have property taxes because they're a stable form of revenue for local government. North Dakota is the most recent state that has really tried to eliminate its property tax because they've come into a lot of energy resources in recent years. But as they had a ballot initiative, I think about 4 years ago, and the ballot initiative actually failed. The voters in North Dakota turned down the very appealing proposition of having no property taxes. So I think that's something that has to be studied and looked at. I know they tried to get it back on the ballot in North Dakota this year, and they were unable to do so for much of the same reasons that we had struggles here in Nebraska with ballot initiatives. Is it was tough in a pandemic to collect signatures, but also the energy sector has been such a yo-yoed kind of environment that to say, well, we don't have to have property taxes anymore because of energy taxes didn't seem like such an easy sell in this environment. So it would be neat to be the first state that would be unable to do it. But I think it's also worthy to say there are lots of states with much lower property taxes than Nebraska. There are lots of ways to get there. And it's about having a conversation with fellow Nebraskans about what ways we think would be the best way to get there.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate that. All right, let's take a look at those poll results. 53% of you out there in the Omaha area would support constitutional amendment to end local property taxes with replacing them with a sales tax of 10.5%, 24% opposed, and 24% of you are undecided. All right, that's one way to attack the problem. Let's talk in more detail about a different proposal. State Senator Ben Hansen introduced a bill that would have created a transparency measure to go along with LB 103, which we discussed earlier. LB 103 is the law that requires local governments to hold a public hearing and vote if they want to collect a windfall from increasing property valuations. But what Senator Hansen's bill does is require that taxpayers receive an advance notice by mail about these public hearings so they can know where to express their concerns about a potential tax increase. In other states, this concept is known as truth in taxation. Looks like this idea is not going to move forward this year, but what are the positives and negatives in your view, Adam and Nicole?
Well, I mean, obviously it's not going to move forward this year. There's only 3 days left in the session. And at this point, they're on select file debate. So if you don't have a bill on select file at this point, you're going to have to reintroduce your proposal next year. And I think that we anticipate, or at least I anticipate based on conversations I've had with senators, that is very likely to happen. As far as the truth in taxation proposal, like I said earlier, I think that, definitely what's good about it is that it promotes transparency and it promotes public engagement so that people, they get a mailed notice to their home that their taxes are going up, that there's going to be a public hearing to discuss the collection of that extra revenue. And it allows people to not only voice their concerns, but it also, elected officials have to vote specifically to collect that windfall. So what it does is it holds elected officials accountable, because if you are having a hearing and proposing to collect windfalls year after year after year, chances of you staying in office in a state where people want lower taxes is probably not going to be very likely. Now, on the downside, long term, if you have several years where, and we have found that this has been effective in Utah, taxes has worked. It's kept taxes low, and they went from being a higher tax state to a lower tax state. But one of the things to caution with it is that sometimes elected officials may be so scared to vote for even a small tax increase if justified, if truly needed. When a tax increase is needed, there may be a large jump. So that is something to keep in mind. You may have some lowering of, some leveling off of those tax increases, but in time there could be a huge jump. Adam, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I mean, truth in taxation, I think the value in Utah has been shown over 30 years. They've kept their property tax burden low, and it's through voter and taxpayer engagement, which I think is a great thing that we, like I said earlier in the program, I just think giving that making that connection between the people who are levying the taxes and the people who are paying the taxes, I think ultimately it's mutually beneficial, even if there are some difficult times when sometimes taxpayers are going to get upset. Yes. But in the big picture, I think the more we can build that connection, the more we're going to have a higher level of morale for the taxes that we pay, and that when policymakers make policy, there's a better understanding of how that's made, and hopefully more public is bought in so that there's not as much anger about policy decisions being made.
I appreciate that, both of you. Let's see how this approach fares in our next poll. How would you vote on a ballot initiative requiring taxpayers to be provided with notice by mail of all public hearings where property taxes may be increased? Let us know if you support, oppose, or undecided. Nicole, briefly here, since we've got a little bit more to address and we're running out of time, what are some of the reactions that you have heard so far about this approach?
Well, when I attended the hearing, I would say most of the attendees at that hearing were opponents. And there were a lot of entities, taxing entities that showed up, a lot of municipalities saying that, no, we can't do this, we can't do this. A lot of it, their biggest concern was the cost of the mailing. So I think that the fact that we are maybe putting some of these taxing entities a little bit on defense shows that it's good policy.
Thanks, Nicole. Let's take a look at those poll results, Adam.
All right. Going once, folks. Anybody want to vote who didn't vote? All right, we're closing it out here, and Jim, we will share the results now.
All right, 79% of you would support having that advance notice by mail of the public hearings. 14% oppose, and 7% are undecided. Thanks for weighing in, everyone. All right, we've talked about a couple ways to change the law so property taxes are more limited or replaced with other kinds of taxes, but there are plenty of Nebraskans who think tax reform, if tax reform is going to be meaningful, changes to government spending have to be part of the mix, but that's easier said than done. I've seen a lot of those comments and sentiments addressed here today. Let's ask the people in attendance tonight if they would support reducing property taxes by reducing spending. So here's the question. In order to reduce local property taxes, would you be willing to reduce government spending if it resulted in cuts in services, including public education, local health programs, or road maintenance? Now, Adam, we've asked this question in different regions of the state because we're interested in how results may differ. What have you noticed so far in the first 4 property tax town halls?
I've noticed that there's a pretty consistent response. And granted, you guys got to keep in mind, I think I noticed it just from the tone and the tempo in the chat section. We appreciate all of your feedback, and there's a lot of good things that we should bring up in future programs. But, you know, typically we've had folks on these programs who are people interested in property taxes. And so they've gotten to the point where it's serious enough that they're having to make sacrifices, that they want to see local political subdivisions make some sacrifices with the property tax that they're having to pay and the spending that is resulting in that. And so generally we've seen, if not the majority, the plurality coming in and saying, yeah, we want to cut spending. I think if that fuels a ballot initiative, then that could be very dangerous for local political subdivisions, because as we were saying before, ballot initiatives, that lets you go around the political process, and you can make decisions that policymakers may be slower to make. Policymakers, though, they have to deal with the constituents who come to them and say, I'm worried about the needs in my life or in my community, and I see needs that are unmet. And I think we can all recognize, especially at the time our country is going through right now, that there are people suffering all over. And so when you put that into the context of a legislature where a filibuster can defeat anything, they're going to say, yeah, it sounds really easy that I could just cut spending and cut your taxes. And maybe there are certainly reforms we can talk about. But those are long discussions about cutting spending, and it's going to be really hard to cut spending overnight in one simple way that's going to solve all your property tax problems. Because if you just wanted to cut property taxes by 20%, let's say, which would be a worthy goal in my estimation, you'd still have to cut property taxes by about $1 billion. Well, you got to find $1 billion to cut then if you want to do it all through cuts. Now, a lot of folks know that we can't just do that all through cuts overnight. So maybe it could be a combination of those things. But when you see the response, you can see that there are folks who want to do it and cut spending, and that's great. Question is, in a ballot campaign, will they all stay on to cut spending, or will they see some of the negative aspects of that and peel off? That's something I'm interested in myself.
All right, let's take a look at those poll results on this question. 40% of you support cuts in spending, 27% say you are opposed, and 33% are undecided.
And that's
All
the
right.
undecided part, right, Jim? I mean, you got to figure, you can be as conservative as you want to be and really believe in limited government. But when it comes time to decide, the things people say are not always the things people do. And because if they were, we'd all have low taxes and limited government and everything would be great, right? Everybody would be cutting our taxes all the time. So that, that's something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. That's good commentary. All right, we got one more poll question in a second, but I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. I know there's been a lot going on just today that could have kept you from joining. From news about the Husker football to weather and power situations here in Omaha, not to mention everything going on in recent months. But before we go, I wanted to check with those in attendance to see how our conversation has changed your perspective about what ought to happen in Nebraska in the years ahead. When we started this town hall series, we didn't really know what the legislature had planned for property taxes. And to be honest, I expected that they would be gridlocked and potentially nothing got done. But they've surprised a lot of people with their own plan and their leadership. And I want to now know from you if you prefer the legislature's approach to some of the alternatives that we've discussed today. Here's our final poll question of the evening. Now that you've heard about some of the issues and potential ideas for property tax reform in Nebraska, who do you believe would do a better job of adopting changes to Nebraska property tax laws? Nebraska voters, the Nebraska legislature, or are you undecided? We'll give you a few seconds here to cast your vote on the final poll of the evening.
Polls are still open, folks, so you can, it's all electronic voting here. You don't have to go to the polls. You don't even have to send it in the mail. You can just do it right here on your PC or mobile device.
All right, Adam, let's take a look at those results. 53% of you say that Nebraska voters would do a better job of adopting changes to Nebraska property tax laws. 33% say the Nebraska legislature, and 13% of you are undecided. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. I'd be grateful for your feedback as the Platt Institute continues its work on removing barriers in Nebraska and for Nebraskans. You can find the recording of this event soon and connect with me and my team anytime at plattinstitute.org on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Everyone have a great evening, and we will see you next time. Thank you.